What if I told you that fire does not merely destroy, but remembers? That within the bones of charred timber, whispers remain, whispers of the night when a house of pride collapsed into embers, taking with it a name that was never meant to survive. You were not supposed to hear this. You were not supposed to know what was written in the ash of 1832, when the Willoughby plantation was claimed by silence. But I will tell you anyway, for once you know, you cannot unknow, and the earth itself will demand your witness. The Willoughby estate stood in Mississippi like a kingdom carved from arrogance, its windows staring across the swamp as though daring the land to resist its order. Cypress trees bent in secret judgment, their roots knotted with the memories of those who bled unseen. The house was ruled by Baroness Vivian Willoughby, a widow carved from ice. Her cruelty never shouted, only smiled. And in her grip lived Malachi, a man stolen, broken, and reforged into labor, and his wife, Ebo, whose silence was older than the swamp, heavier than grief, and sharper than prophecy. But silence in Willoughby was never neutral. It was weapon and warning both. For Malachi's obedience was not loyalty. It was survival, honed like a blade hidden beneath cloth. And Ebo's silence was not submission. It was listening. She heard the swamp when others heard only insects. She heard the pulse of roots when others saw only dirt. She carried a language too old for the Baroness to name, a rhythm not of slavery, but of reckoning. One morning, Vivian called Malachi into the drawing room. Imagine him there, surrounded by portraits of pale ancestors who watched with hollow eyes, each brushstroke a witness to crimes left unnamed. She sipped her tea as though it were blood. Her words were silk-hiding steel. My sons need a father. They need your hand, your discipline. You will stand where their true fae, there no longer does. Do you feel it? The insult laced as elevation, the cruelty veiled as duty? To demand that the enslaved raise the master's blood as his own. That was no request, it was a curse. Malachi bowed, not as a man, but as a shadow before a blade. And from that moment forward, he was chained not to the fields, but to a role twisted beyond endurance. The soil outside darkened that day. Even the swamp held its breath. Something had shifted. Something was waiting. From that day, Malachi no longer bent over rows of cotton beneath the overseer's whip. Instead, he was pulled into the orbit of the mansion, a new kind of prison where walls whispered more than chains. He taught the boys to fish, to carve, to pray, lessons of survival disguised as fatherhood. But every word spoken, every hand laid on their shoulders, was a theft from his own blood, a demand carved into his back by the Baroness's will. Ebo, his wife, watched from the periphery. She fed the children of her oppressor, wiped their mouths clean as though they were not the spawn of cruelty. Each act was a wound without blood, a ritual humiliation that stole the marrow from her silence. Yet still, she did not speak. She only stared, into the boys' pale faces, into Malachi's weary eyes, into the swamp that murmured at dusk. The Baroness grew proud of her arrangement. She called it family. She commissioned a portrait to prove it, summoning an artist from New Orleans who spread his paints like a priest spreads doctrine. There, on the canvas, Malachi was placed at her side, Ebo behind her, and the boys before them, an abomination dressed in oil and varnish. When the portrait dried, it was not art, but a spell, a grotesque binding meant to trap them in a fiction no prayer could undo. But fiction has cracks, and cracks let whispers through. At night, when the lamps burned low and the house exhaled in its creaking bones, Ebo's silence changed. It was no longer the silence of defeat. It was a silence that listened. From the swamp, a murmur rose, a sound not caught by the ear, but by the ribs. It pressed behind bone like an old memory demanding to be remembered. Some nights, the frogs stopped mid-croak, as if silenced by a command older than speech. It was then the elders began to speak in warnings. Uma, the oldest among the enslaved, told Malachi, "The earth is a sleepwalker. It rise tyrants so long as silence holds. But one true word, spoken not with the mouth but with the spine, will wake it, and it will roll them into the mud." Malachi did not yet understand, but Ebo did. Her silence had become listening, and her listening had become alignment. Something was gathering in her, something that would soon demand to be named. The portrait was unveiled in midsummer, when the air lay heavy like wet cloth on the skin. The house filled with neighbors, planters, and matrons who smelled of sweat, perfume, and rot, disguised as civility. They gasped in admiration at the painted lie. The Baroness enthroned, her sons radiant, and Malachi at her side, not as slave, but as guardian, an illusion framed in gold. But not all gasps were praise. Some muttered unease. They whispered behind lace fans, too much pride, too much mingling of order and disorder. For even among the cruel, there were boundaries. The Baroness had blurred them, and blurred lines summoned shadows. That night, after the guests had departed and the house groaned beneath its swollen pride, the swamp spoke louder than ever. Cicadas screamed, then fell abruptly silent. The air pressed close, not wind, but weight. Malachi lay restless on his cot, but Ebo sat upright, eyes open, staring through the boards as though they were transparent. She heard it clearly now, a rhythm, steady and patient, like a drum sunk beneath the mud. And with the rhythm came words, not English, not French, but the root tongue carried across oceans in the belly of ships. Words older than chains, older than sugar, older than the Baroness's bloodline. The house is not wood, but flesh. The swamp is not water, but memory. What is taken will be returned. The next morning, Ebo broke her silence, not with voice, but with act. She walked into the swamp alone, feet sinking in black water, mosquitoes singing around her like a choir of knives. She did not swat them away. She bent low, pressing her palms into the mud until her nails filled with soil. She whispered into the ground, not sound, but breath, feeding it with the marrow of her rage. When she returned, her dress clung dark and wet to her body, and her eyes burned as though she had carried fire back from beneath the roots. She spoke to Malachi only one sentence: "The swamp has woken." From that day, strange things began. Lanterns sputtered without cause. Milk curdled overnight. The portrait in the hall would not stay still. Neighbors swore its eyes shifted, its colors dimmed. One of the Baroness's sons woke screaming of a black hand rising from beneath his bed, and the frogs, oh the frogs, sang in a cadence too human, too deliberate, as if echoing the rhythm Ebo had heard. Vengeance had taken root. It was only waiting for its harvest. The first punishment was small, almost forgettable. So small the Baroness dismissed it as coincidence. A servant boy was found at dawn, staring into the cypress grove, his mouth full of mud, though he had not drowned. He could not speak after, not a word, only croaks and guttural sounds like the frogs at night. Then came the livestock. Cows bellowed and collapsed with their bellies swollen, as though the swamp itself had fed them rot. Chickens wandered into the forest and never returned. Even the dogs whined at the threshold, refusing to cross into the house after sunset. Their hackles rose at shadows that no candle could dispel. But the true terror came with the boys. One evening, the youngest, Samuel, sat at supper, spoon in hand, when he froze. His eyes widened, pupils drowning in black. He turned to his mother and whispered, "She's calling me." His voice was not his own. It carried the weight of mud and centuries, of drowned throats crying from beneath the swamp. The Baroness slapped him hard, desperate to break the spell, but the boy only laughed, a laugh too deep, too wrong for a child. That night, he was found sleepwalking, standing knee-deep in the swamp water, arms outstretched as though answering a summons. Malachi pulled him back, his strength barely enough to tear him from the muck that clutched like hands. The boy clawed at him, shrieking, "Let me go to her! She waits in the dark!" The Baroness, pale with fury and fear, accused Malachi and Ebo of poisoning her children's minds. She threatened whips, iron, the auction block. But her threats rang hollow in the heavy air. For even as she screamed, the walls of the house groaned like something alive, timbers bending as though under an unseen tide. Ebo said nothing. She stood at the edge of the hall, her silence sharper than any blade. Malachi, weary but unbroken, met his wife's eyes and saw the truth, the sabi. Amp was no longer whispering. It was speaking. It had chosen its language, and it had chosen its vessel. The portrait above the fireplace began to change. Where once Malachi was painted at the Baroness's side, his likeness darkened, his eyes sank into shadow, his hands dripped with a color too deep to be paint. The artist had not painted this. The house itself was repainting the lie, revealing the truth. By then, it was too late. The swamp had begun its claim. The house began to breathe. Not metaphor, not imagination, breathe. Floors swelled and sighed in the dark, as though lungs were hidden beneath the planks. Doors refused to stay shut, opening in slow creaks to corridors heavy with the smell of swamp water and iron. Even in daylight, the air was damp, walls weeping moisture that streaked the wallpaper like tears. The Baroness fought it with candles, with holy water fetched from the chapel, with priests who muttered Latin until their tongues dried. None of it worked. The candles drowned themselves in sudden draughts. The holy water steamed away as if the wood spat it back. And the priests? One collapsed mid-prayer, his eyes rolled white, his body convulsing as a frog leapt from his mouth. He never returned. Yet the Baroness refused surrender. Pride was her marrow. She declared war not on the swamp, but on those she believed had brought it into her home. She chained Ebo in the courtyard, sun beating down on her skin until it blistered, until the air reeked of scorched flesh. She locked Malachi in the root cellar, where the damp grew thick and suffocating. She thought suffering would break them. She thought pain could smother silence. But silence does not break. It deepens. And as Ebo hung beneath the sun, she did not scream. She hummed. Barely a sound, a vibration more than a song, but it rippled through the courtyard, into the soil, down into the roots that writhed unseen. The swamp answered in kind. A long, low rumble that shook the shutters. Glass fractured in every window. Birds scattered from the cypress trees, shrieking like alarm bells. That night, the house attacked its mistress. The Baroness woke to the sensation of breath on her neck. She turned, but no one was there. Only shadows that bent too sharply against the walls. Her bed frame shuddered as if gripped by unseen hands. When she tried to stand, her feet sank into the rug, soft fibers tightening like mud until she could not pull free. From the corner of the room, water seeped upward, not downward, upward, pooling into shapes, into arms, into faces. They pressed toward her, with mouths open in drowned screams. She fought like a beast, clawing free, fleeing down the stairs in her nightdress. But every step echoed with a rhythm, steady, deliberate. The swamp's drum, the same rhythm that Ebo had heard, now beating inside the walls, inside her skull. For the first time, the Baroness understood. The house was no longer hers. The nights grew longer, though the calendar insisted summer still held sway. The moon hung swollen and red above the cypress grove, bleeding light across the swamp. Within the house, time itself seemed to sag. Hours stretched. Candles melted faster. Shadows lingered long after sunrise. The boys suffered first. Samuel, who once laughed like bells, now spoke only in riddles, his child's voice echoing with tones too old for his mouth. He scratched symbols into the floorboards with his fingernails, patterns that spiraled like the coils of roots beneath the mud. His brother, Thomas, woke covered in algae, his sheets damp as though he had been sleeping underwater. Their eyes grew sunken, their skin clammy, and when they opened their mouths, frogs leapt out, slick and croaking. The Baroness clutched them tighter, screaming for God to protect her bloodline. But God was silent here. Only the swamp answered. And the swamp was patient no longer. Servants vanished. One by one, their beds were found empty, their tools abandoned. Some swore they saw them afterward, standing waist-deep in the marsh, eyes wide and mouths moving in unison with the frog chorus. They did not struggle. They did not plead. They only swayed to the rhythm of the unseen drum, bodies becoming reeds in the tide of vengeance. Malachi, still chained, began to hear voices seeping through the stone of the cellar. Not whispers, but instructions. They told him to endure. They told him the chain was not his shackle, but his anchor. They told him a flood was coming, and he would not drown. He would rise. Above him, Ebo's silence ended. She spoke at last, not to the Baroness, not to Malachi, but to the house itself. Her words were low, foreign, carrying the cadence of earth and water. She spoke to the beams, to the bricks, to the portrait that still hung grotesque above the fireplace. And as she spoke, the portrait warped again. Malachi's figure grew darker, taller, his hands no longer dripping paint but reaching out, as though ready to strangle the woman beside him. The Baroness's face blurred, her eyes melting into hollows. That night, rain fell, not from the sky, but from the ceilings. Black water, thick with silt and frogs, pouring down the stairs, flooding the halls. The house did not resist. It drank, it shuddered, it laughed. The drowned were coming home. The night of reckoning arrived without thunder, without storm, only silence so absolute it pressed against the skull. Not even insects dared to sing. The swamp lay still, a mirror of black glass beneath the swollen moon. Inside the Willoughby house, every candle extinguished itself at once, plunging the Baroness and her cursed household into a darkness thick as pitch. From the silence came a sound, the steady rhythm of drums, not struck by human hands, but by the earth itself. Floorboards thudded in time, window panes rattled in cadence. Even the heartbeats of those within seemed bound to its pulse. The boys were the first to move. Samuel and Thomas rose from their beds, eyes blank, feet carrying them without hesitation down the staircase into the flooded hall. Water lapped at their ankles, then their knees, yet they did not stumble. They walked as though the swamp had claimed them already. Their mother screamed, rushing to seize them, but the black water surged upward, slamming her back against the wall with the force of a wave. Malachi's chains broke in the cellar, not by key, not by hand, but by rust crumbling under pressure too ancient to resist. He emerged into the hall, his body glistening with the same black water, his eyes no longer weary but burning, fierce, unbroken. And Ebo stood at the center of it all, no longer silent. Her voice rose in the old tongue, each word carrying weight, each syllable a command. She did not shout, she did not wail. She spoke with calm precision, and the house obeyed. Beams cracked, staircases buckled, portraits wept oil like blood. The false family the Baroness had painted dissolved before her eyes. The drowned came next. From the water, faces surfaced, men, women, children, their mouths spilling mud and frogs. They reached with hands of silt and bone, clutching at the Baroness's skirts, her arms, her hair. She thrashed, shrieked, clawed, but there was no escape. For every grasp she tore free from, 3 more replaced it. The swamp did not hunger for her blood. It hungered for her fear, her arrogance, her legacy. As the black tide rose to her chin, she locked eyes with Malachi one final time. He did not strike her. He did not speak. He only watched, his silence heavier than any blow, for vengeance did not require his hand. The swamp itself would deliver the sentence. And so the Baroness was pulled under. By dawn, the Willoughby plantation was gone. Where once a grand house had loomed, only a skeleton of beams jutted from the swamp, blackened and dripping, half swallowed by mud. The air stank of wet ash and something older, something that tasted of endings. Crows circled above, their cries sharp and mocking, as if they carried news of the fall to every corner of the land. The Baroness was never seen again. Some say her body was devoured by the swamp, digested into muck and root. Others whisper she still lingers beneath the water, her pale hands clawing upward, her mouth locked in a scream no air will carry. The truth is worse. She became part of it. Her pride, her cruelty, her very name dissolved into the swamp's endless memory, trapped forever in its black tide. The boys, Samuel and Thomas, were found standing waist-deep among the reeds at sunrise. Their eyes were clear, their voices gone. They never spoke again. Neighbors who dared to take them in reported strange happenings: milk spoiling in their presence, doors opening on their own, frogs gathering beneath their windows in unnatural silence. Some claimed the boys hummed in their sleep, not a child's tune, but the same steady drumbeat that had doomed the house. In time, both vanished. No one knows if they wandered into the swamp or if the swamp came for them. But Malachi and Ebo endured. Freed from chains not by man, but by the earth itself, they walked away as the ruins smoldered behind them. Survivors said the pair did not look back. Their silence was no longer burden, but power, carried in every step across the sodden ground. Some believed they vanished into the swamps to live among the drowned, others that they fled northward, carrying with them the knowledge that silence could be a blade sharper than iron. The Willoughby name rotted with the house. Land records were scrubbed, neighbors spoke little of what Tiamon, Hay, had seen. Yet travelers at night swore they could hear it, the creak of beams that no longer stood, the low hum of a woman's voice rising from the reeds, the splash of unseen steps pacing just beyond sight. Even now the locals warn, do not linger by the swamp after sundown, do not follow the drums, and if you hear silence too thick, too heavy, leave at once, for silence remembers, and silence always returns.